The orchard lay in the shadow of the old chapel, dense with gnarled trees that bore fruit only once a year. The locals whispered that as soon as the harvest moon rose, every apple seemed to glitter in dark premonition. The orchard was said to be cursed. No matter how much was pruned, nor how diligently it was tended, the place remained. Overgrown with brambles that twined around trunk and branch like serpents. Even in broad daylight, a coldness clung to the air between the tall rows of ancient trees. No one dared to pick the apples themselves, for a legend, long spoken in hushed tones, warned of a ghostly bride, a wraith-like figure wandering the orchard at midnight on the harvest moon. Her dress stained with earth and time, her face hidden by a tattered veil. She carried a rusted scythe that, legend claimed, dripped with the blood of those who dared defy her. Children recited her story around the schoolyard, adults described her in private gatherings, and visitors found themselves uneasy the moment they stepped onto the orchard grounds. It was the orchard itself, blackened soil, twisted branches, eerie hush, that seemed to beckon her presence. On the eve of another harvest moon, a young traveler named Maris arrived in the village. She was not exactly a tourist. Her grandmother had told her long ago tales of distant relatives who once lived near the orchard. She believed the orchard belonged to her family, or so the stories said, and she intended to unravel the secrets that had haunted her lineage. She approached the property at twilight, while hazy clouds drifted across the sky, filtering the last golden rays of the sun. A rusty iron gate guarded the orchard, flanked by two ancient yew trees whose root systems groped the ground like skeletal fingers. She tried to swing the gate open, but it screeched in protest and refused to budge more than a foot. Resolute, Maris squeezed through the narrow gap, pushing back her apprehension. She found herself on a winding path of withered grass, leading deeper into the orchard. An owl screeched overhead. The rustling of leaves against her jacket felt as though unseen hands tugged at her every step, urging her to turn back. But Maris pressed on. At the center of the orchard, beneath an oak reputed to be older than any living person in the region, stood a dilapidated cottage. Her research had told her it once belonged to the caretaker who tended the orchard centuries ago. The man's name had been Samuel Ashcroft. Rumored to be the orchard's last living caretaker, he was blamed and pitied. A terrible misfortune befell a young bride on her wedding day, an event that forever cast an infernal shadow over the orchard. Maris pushed open the cottage's door and stepped into a single musty room. Dust motes swirled in the air, illuminated by her flashlight. A stone hearth dominated one corner, its logs rotted into lumps of fungus. Threadbare curtains hung limply from a window, clinging to the stained glass, as though yearning to hide the orchard from view. She was about to cross the threshold into the next room when she spotted a tattered journal lying atop a rickety table. Its leather cover was mottled with dark splotches, and the binding threatened to crumble in her hands. Gently she turned the first page. September 3rd, in the year of our Lord 1734, the spidery handwriting read, "Our orchard thriveth well after the new planting." She skimmed the entry, flipping through the journal to find more significant passages. Slowly, a story unfurled before her. The orchard's caretaker had arranged a marriage between his only daughter, Rosamond, and a merchant's son. The orchard was to be her dowry, ensuring that the caretaker's lineage would retain guardianship of its bountiful harvest for generations. However, tragedy had intervened. The groom never arrived on the wedding day, and in her heartbreak, days later her body was found beneath the great apple tree on the far side of the orchard, dressed in her wedding gown, clutching a scythe used for cutting herbs. Maris's throat tightened as she read the caretaker's pleas for forgiveness. He wrote how he had shorted the bridegroom's family on promised finances, twisting the orchard's bounty into an advantage for himself. When the truth emerged, the union was called off, leaving Rosamond at the altar, alone and consumed by shame. Some entries suggested that in her anguish she used the orchard's scythe on herself. Others believed she fell victim to an intruder, lured by rumors of her father's wealth. All the caretaker knew was that his beloved daughter was found with that scythe, and her face was locked in a grimace of rage. The final entry read, "I see her at night, in the orchard, in that stained dress. She walks the rows, gazing upon the apples, as though they hold the key to her vengeance. No more shall I keep secrets. The orchard is cursed by a father's betrayal, a bride's sorrow." Maris closed the journal, feeling a chill course through her. She recalled her grandmother's stories, how each generation believed that the orchard needed an heir to keep the spirit at rest, or else Rosamund's ghost would appear under the harvest moon, seeking retribution with the rusted scythe that once ended her life. Maris wondered if she was now the orchard's rightful heir. If so, perhaps she held the power to end the curse. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and a pale moon was climbing the sky, almost full. The path back to the gate felt darker than before, and every branch overhead seemed to reach for her. She hurried to the village inn, determined to return the next night when the moon would be at its zenith. That evening she dined with the local tavern keeper, an elderly man named Bernard. He recognized her as an outsider who found her way to the orchard and silently shook his head when she inquired further. However, he was not entirely unwilling to speak. "Folk round here pay no mind to old stories most of the year," Bernard said, stirring his stew. "But come harvest, they remember the bride. Rosamund roams among those apple trees, a scythe in her hand, sorrow and wrath in her heart." He sighed. He warned Maris that some who ventured there on a harvest moon never returned. Something about Rosamund. That rose, I saw a figure in a sickly white gown, ragged around the edges. The scythe she held glimmered with rust, as if soaked by time's cruelty. He warned Maris that some who ventured there on a harvest moon never returned. Something about Rosamund's gaze, her eyes black with betrayal, could lure others into sharing her torment. She's searching for a path out of her sorrow, or maybe just seeking vengeance against the living. Maris's heart fluttered with unease that night, but she was resolved to put Rosamund's spirit to rest. As the final night of the harvest moon approached, she made her preparations: a lantern, sturdy boots, and a mind armed with the caretaker's journal. If she could return the orchard to Rosamund's rightful ownership, or show her that the place no longer needed spilled blood to survive, perhaps she could release the wraith from her mournful vigil. The night of the harvest moon arrived. The sky was slick with clouds, and the swollen orb of pale light glowed with a feverish intensity. Maris slipped through the orchard's gate again, heart hammering in her chest. Stepping onto the path, she glanced upward. The clouds parted like a curtain, revealing the moon in its resplendent fullness. Each orchard row was shadowed in the moon's silver glow. She could hear the rustle of leaves in the faint breeze, but even more unsettling was the echo of footsteps, or the soft clang of metal that seemed to follow her. It was impossible to discern direction in the gloom. Every twisting trunk and drifting silhouette seemed alive with secret. Maris made her way toward the great oak at the orchard center, holding the journal tight against her chest as though it were a shield. The sound of her boots crunching on the brittle grass rang too loud in her ears. The deeper she ventured, the less certain she became of her own surroundings. The orchard felt vast, infinite in the dim moonlight, its rows repeating like endless corridors in a labyrinth. From time to time she thought she glimpsed a pale figure in the corner of her eye, but each time she turned, she saw only twisting branches and the faint quiver of leaves. Suddenly the orchard fell silent. No wind, no crickets, no sound at all. Maris paused, gripping the lantern's handle until her knuckles whitened. The hush pressed down on her, and she could feel a presence, cold, ominous, and seething with resentment. Then, in the distance, she heard a scraping sound like metal dragged against stone. She dared not move. The noise drew closer, accompanied by a soft hiss of cloth trailing along the ground. And then she saw it, a form in white, face obscured by a threadbare veil, stepping from behind a cluster of apple trees. The figure raised its arm. Maris could make out a long, curved blade, crusted with rust the color of dried blood. The spirit advanced, slow and graceful, her head tilted at a broken angle as though she were listening to the orchard's hush. Without thinking, Maris called out, voice trembling. "Rosamond," she said, addressing the figure by the name passed down through the caretaker's journal. "I know your sorrow. I've come to grant you peace." Still, the bride came forward, the scythe's tip cutting lazy streaks through the air. Her gown fluttered, revealing patches of mud and dried leaves tangled in the lace. At once, Maris realized that everything around her seemed unnaturally illuminated, not just by the moon, but by some ethereal glow emanating from the bride. The orchard felt alive with raw emotion, and each branch groaned as though reflecting Rosamond's seething anger. Desperate not to panic, Maris opened the caretaker's journal at a page she had bookmarked, a blessing that the caretaker once wrote, an attempt to absolve himself and his daughter of the orchard's burden. She knew it might be a faint hope, but it was all she had. She began to read it aloud, stumbling over archaic words. Pleas for forgiveness, acknowledgments of wrongdoing, and a final vow that the orchard would be Rosamond's rightful inheritance, granting her rest from her endless wandering. As the words spilled forth in the still air, Rosamond halted. The scythe went still in her pale hand. Her veil shifted, revealing a jaw clenched in tormented sorrow. Maris dared to step closer, heart beating so loudly in her ears that she could scarcely hear her own voice. For a moment, Maris thought the bride would vanish. She hoped the vow had freed Rosamond. But then Rosamond's head snapped toward her, and Maris was transfixed by hollow eyes glimmering with malice. Rosamond raised the scythe high, and a shriek tore from her lips. Her voice was a chorus of anguish, centuries of pain and fury unleashed upon the night. Maris dropped the journal in horror, stumbling backward. A savage wind exploded through the orchard, rattling the branches with an unholy din. The apples that had stubbornly clung to the branches fell in sudden cascades, striking the ground in volleys. Over the howl of the wind, Maris could hear a low moaning, as though the orchard itself was crying out in torment. Fearing for her life, Maris scrambled away. She had not expected that Rosamond's grief and rage would be so powerful after all these years. The caretaker's vow, however sincere, was already drowned out by the bride's scream. Shadows whipped around the orchard rows. The trees appeared to stretch and twist, forming monstrous silhouettes. Maris felt her own mind teeter on the brink of panic. She half ran, half stumbled past the rows, trying to make her way back to the orchard's entrance. But the path had changed. Where there should have been an opening, she found more twisted branches and tangles of brambles. She spun in a circle, disoriented. Behind her, a flash of white flickered, accompanied by the sound of that scythe dragging across the ground. In desperation, she realized she had to confront Rosamond. She rose to her feet, breathing hard, and clasped her hands around the lantern. A flicker of resolve ignited in her. She could not leave the orchard to claim another victim. She had to face the bride and speak the caretaker's final words, no matter what horror might come. Pushing through the brambles, limbs scratched and bleeding, Maris returned to the center of the orchard. The wind died as she arrived, as though her presence was expected. There stood Rosamond, lit by an eerie moonlight that made her dress glow a sickly gray. She hovered in front of the great oak, the very place Maris had found the caretaker's cottage. Rosamond's veil fluttered, revealing hollow eyes and a face once beautiful, now etched with utter despair. Maris's voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "I am of your blood," she said, recalling the caretaker's line and her grandmother's stories. "This orchard is yours, Rosamond. Take it. Claim it as your rightful inheritance. Let your grieving soul rest." Rosamond hissed softly, tilting her head. In a single fluid motion, she flung the scythe forward. The blade's edge gleamed, coming within a hair's breadth of Maris's chest before stopping as if caught by an invisible barrier. Maris gasped, but repeated her words more firmly. "It was never my right to inherit. It's yours. I release all claims in your name. Let the orchard bear fruit in peace." The specter's grip wavered, and for the first time, Rosamond's expression flickered with something other than rage, perhaps confusion or distant memory. Maris carefully retrieved the dropped journal from the ground. With trembling hands, she opened it to the caretaker's vow. She held it up for Rosamond to see, though the ghost's eyes appeared clouded and distant. And then, softly, she read the lines of the caretaker's final plea. "Let my betrayal be undone by truth. Let Rosamond reclaim this orchard and rest her weary soul. Let the seeds of sorrow be plucked from the soil, so no further blood be spilled upon this hallowed ground. In the Lord's name, may her spirit find the peace I was too late to give." As soon as Maris uttered these words, a heavy silence fell. The moon seemed to dim and then flare again, sending a cascade of silver across the orchard. Rosamond inhaled, or so it appeared. Her form quivered. Slowly, so slowly, she sank to her knees, letting the scythe fall from her grip. It clattered to the ground, rust flaking off in a shower of red specks. The bride lifted pallid hands toward Maris, an almost pleading gesture. Maris knelt too, bracing herself for whatever might happen next. She saw Rosamond up close now. Behind the veil, her face was corporeal yet translucent, her wide eyes filled with eons of sorrow. Maris could sense the cold radiating from that mournful stare. Taking a trembling breath, Maris reached out and touched the bride's hand. It felt like a chill wind across her fingertips. Suddenly Rosamond bowed her head. A faint light, like a dying candle flame, began to pulse from her chest. It flickered once, twice, and then brightened, radiating outward in luminous streams. The entire orchard was awash in that glow. The ragged edges of her wedding gown lost their tattered look, and for a moment, the orchard's gnarled trees seemed to stand straighter, their leaves regaining a healthy gloss. Then the specter rose to her feet. She looked down at the scythe, and with a final, trembling exhale, she released a weary moan that resonated through the orchard. The scythe dissolved into rusted dust, scattering in the breeze. Rosamond's face lifted to the sky, and her veil tore free, drifting away like a piece of moonlit cloud, till it vanished in the darkness. A single tear slipped down Rosamond's cheek, silver in the moonlight, and with that final sign of regret, she faded into an ethereal mist that the wind carried away. The orchard's hush deepened and became peaceful. Maris remained kneeling on the ground, trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Around her, the glow that had enveloped the orchard receded, returning to the pale moonlight of the late hour. She could still hear the soft rustle of leaves, but it was a gentler melody now, as though the orchard released a sigh of relief. At length, she stood and gazed around, noticing that the trees were no longer as oppressive or menacing. The brambles that had ensnared the pathways seemed to have loosened their grip, providing a clear route back to the gate. Her mild wounds stung and her limbs ached, but a sense of completion warmed her. She walked out through the orchard in the early hours before dawn. The gate offered no resistance this time. It opened upon her first pull. The orchard looked almost welcoming, bathed in the soft purple glow of the receding night. In the following days, the village noticed the orchard was different. The tavern keeper spoke of an unusual stillness, a new calm. The apples showed a new vibrancy, deeper in color. People no longer murmured rumors about a scythe-wielding apparition prowling the rows. Some harvesters even ventured in, tentatively picking apples without the familiar dread that once shadowed them. Maris spent a few days in the village, recovering in the inn's modest comfort. When Bernard asked what happened, she explained only that she believed Rosamond could finally rest. She placed the caretaker's journal in Bernard's keeping for the village's records, hoping it would serve as a cautionary tale and a historical piece of their heritage. With no further reason to remain, Maris prepared to depart. though the orchard would forever remain entwined with her own story. She took one last walk through the orchard as the leaves started to turn gold and red. The hush still lingered, but it was a peaceful quiet, devoid of the malignant gloom that once saturated every branch. She passed the old oak toward the remains of the caretaker's cottage. At the threshold, she paused to look upon the broken hearth and the crumbling walls that once sheltered secrets and heartbreak. The orchard, she sensed, belonged to Rosamund now, in whatever afterlife existed for her. The caretaker's vow was finally fulfilled. On her way out, Maris noticed a single apple had fallen at her feet. It was remarkably perfect unbruised, with a ruby-red color. She picked it up and gazed at its smooth skin, remembering the orchard's thick gloom, the bride's chilling scream, and the final gleam of peace in Rosamund's eyes. She took a small bite. The flavor was sweet, laced with a note of bittersweet memory, as though carrying centuries of pain and longing in its flesh. Softly, she replaced the apple under the tree, a silent offering of gratitude. Then she made her exit, leaving the orchard in the dawn light. Beyond the gate, the rolling hills of the countryside opened before her. A sense of renewal buoyed her, as though the orchard's release from centuries of torment somehow freed her as well. She departed the village soon after, never forgetting the pale bride and her rusted scythe. Locals now speak of a gentler orchard, one that may still bear echoes of its dark past, but offers a kinder spirit in its harvest. If one listens carefully under the harvest moon, they might hear a faint rustling amid the trees, a whisper of laced skirts, a long-forgotten sorrow revisited. Yet they will find no blade or blood, no dark silhouette drifting between rows in a veil of anguish. Rosamund's chapter may be closed, her spirit at rest, the orchard's curse lifted at last. Only the moon, shining full on every harvest, remains a silent witness, revealing a land reclaimed by humble wonder, rather than the terror that once held it hostage. And though midnight shadows may still conjure images of a scorned bride beneath the orchard's boughs, her scythe has turned to dust, her tears have fallen away, and she is free from an endless circle of grief, brought to peace by the heir who finally granted her the orchard she was owed so many centuries ago.